Thank you very much, John. Very generous introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this evening about marketing, particularly in the face of the current recession. I realise that I stand between you and having more beers in a little while, so as Elizabeth Taylor said to her various husbands, I won't keep you too long. So what I want to do is go through, Alex, we put the, thank you very much, go through the key points as listed in the brochure. Just want to talk about, first of all, background of the company, but move on to the impact on beer sales and home brew in the recession. Talk about advertising, obviously, and environmental, touch on environmental sustainability and philanthropy as well. So first of all, in terms of the background, just a few key points. Cooper's was started in 1862 by Thomas Cooper, who many of you probably know the story, brewed up his first batch of beer as a tonic for his wife, Anne, who was unwell at the time. Anne was the daughter of a publican back in Yorkshire, and of course that emigrated out to Australia. Thomas and Anne had emigrated out in 1852, and anyway, when she was unwell, she prevailed upon her husband to brew up a batch of beer, apparently in the family bath. And from that time, Thomas developed a keen interest in brewing. He had been working as a stonemason, and prior to that as a shoemaker. So he had a couple of changes in career as well. And he started selling beer door to door and to friends, and gradually the popularity of Cooper's increased. Towards the end of that 19th century, Cooper's was still only 12th out of 15 breweries in Adelaide. And I think there were some 8 country breweries which were bigger than Cooper's. So the company's done well to survive the various consolidations that have occurred over the time subsequently. Before we get on to home brew, I want to mention that Cooper's have always been predominantly brewers of ales and stout, and in particular naturally conditioned beers. But in the 1960s, the company started to be concerned that lager beer might take over altogether from ales and stout. And of course, as you know, lager is about 97% of the beer market in Australia. So we did get into lager production in the late 60s, but it didn't go very well. And the company spent a lot of money, and there was some problems in the 70s with recessions in the 70s, the oil shocks and increases in excise. And so the company was in real financial turmoil through the mid-70s, and hence my generation weren't encouraged to go into the company. But one of the things that did help enormously was the introduction of home brew. There'd been a change in the legislation, which meant that home brewing was now legal, to be brewing beer above what was previously a very low level of alcohol of 1.15%. So it became legal, and Cooper's got into it very early on as a result of finding a way to keep sterile wort in a plastic bag, and that's initially how it was sold, in a 20-litre plastic bag. Later on in 1984, we introduced the evaporation plant, which enabled us to be able to present the home brew in the familiar cans that you see there. And we got into export after that, and grew our volume both overseas and domestically. And so by 1990, Cooper's was the largest producer of largest producer of homebrew kits in the world, thanks mainly to having a good market in Australia, but also having strong markets in Scandinavia, North America, and elsewhere where excise duty was high. So that evaporation plant also allowed the company to get into the production of malt extract, which remains a third part of our business. We're the sole domestic supplier of malt extract to the food companies in Australia, and so that's to Kraft and Kellogg's and Uncle Toby's and Cadbury's and Mars and so forth. So it's used in confectionery and baking and breakfast cereals. And so we produce about 5,000 tonnes of malt extract a year, in addition to about 3,500 tonnes of home brew. So that allowed us to survive through the difficult periods of the 70s and even the 80s. Things were still a little bit dire for the company. We managed to start selling beer outside of South Australia. My father, Bill Cooper, really focused on that through the 80s, so that by 1990 we were selling nearly half of our beer outside of South Australia. And so by that stage, the company was starting to be in a slightly stronger position. There were some unrelated diversification efforts that were made in the late 80s and early 90s, which didn't prove all that successful. So we gradually got out of those through the 90s. So things were a little bit topsy-turvy until about the mid-90s, when beer sales started to pick up again after the recession, and we'll touch on that again in a little while. A couple of the other things that helped us enormously through this period of the 90s and the growth that we appreciated through that time was Lion Nathan buying South Australian Brewing, and they did that in late 93, and initially their marketing efforts were rather poor, and so they lost, they went from 75% of the local market here down to 50% over a period of a few years, and they made the excellent decision for us to sell the hotels that South Australian Brewing owned, about 120 hotels, and that meant for the first time we could start selling keg beer into those hotels. And not just because JB's here, I do want to mention that KWP made an enormous difference to us with their innovative advertising through the 90s and continue to do so for us, and that really has raised the awareness of Coopers in the minds of the consumer. So we also made some incremental gains in quality through the 90s as well. And so just in summary then, we see the Cooper's advantage now in terms of our core capabilities as being experts in differentiating